A very good morning, everyone. On behalf of the ASEAN Study Center, thank you for joining this live webinar broadcasting on YouTube. Welcome all and welcome back to our second Bincang ASEAN in 2021, presented by the ASEAN Study Center from the Faculty of Social and Political Science, Universitas Gadjah Mada. My name is Fadila and I am a program officer at ASEAN Study Center. I will be here today as the master of ceremony and thank you very much for attending. Our topic today is Myanmar protests and unrest, a test for ASEAN. And we have invited our special guests with us to talk about the issue. They are Dr. Rizal Sukma, a senior researcher at Center for Strategic and International Studies, and also former ambassador of the Republic of Indonesia to UK, Ireland, and the International Maritime Organizations, or IMO. And also Nicholas Jude Martinez from Global Campus Coalitions for Human Rights and a representative for Free Salin campaign movement. All right, before we start, I would like to inform to all the participants of today's webinar, if you have any questions that you would like to address, please send it directly on the document sections in our YouTube live stream, in the comment sections. Sorry, and don't forget to mention your name. To start our Bincang ASEAN, I would like to welcome Ms. Yulida that will lead us to the introductions to our speakers as well as to bridge the discussions. So Ms. Yulida is the Managing Director of the ASEAN Study Center of Gadjah Mada University. Having completed her undergraduate degree from Gadjah Mada University studying international relations, she went on to read international public policy at University College London. Yulida previously worked at the ASEAN Secretariat facilitating political cooperations and is a traveling scholar with areas of interest in transnationalism, oil and gas, and ASEAN in its political security context. So without further ado, Ms. Yulida, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fadila, for the introduction. I hope everyone can hear me all right. Welcome to our discussion titled Myanmar Protests and Unrest, a Test for ASEAN Diplomacy. As pointed out, Bincang ASEAN is a series of discussions which aims to highlight urgent issues pertinent to ASEAN. Now, in the recent weeks, we have been following the campaign of #FreeSalin, a regular student, a law-abiding citizen who happens to be studying human rights. He was arbitrarily arrested and detained in March in Myanmar. Now, Salin's arrest is one of the many who have been repressed of the right to education since Tatmadaw took over. Now, our discussion today will hopefully highlight this, and particularly the rights of education under the current regime. Now, taking this into a greater context, we see now that ASEAN is under the spotlight and is facing great criticism. On the one hand, they seem to not be engaging enough, but on the other, it has also faced criticism for engaging the wrong actors, in this case, the junta, the Tatmadaw. And further, by welcoming them to the ASEAN summit, in so doing, they are acknowledging its legitimacy. At least this is the argument that the critiques share. Now, today we hope to discuss this from a diplomacy and human rights point of view. To help delve deeper into the issue, we have here with us two esteemed guest speakers who will shed light and share their views on the situation in Myanmar. Our first guest speaker is Mr. Jude. Allow me to read his biography. Nicholas Jude Martinez is currently a student of the European Master's Program in Human Rights Democratization of the Global Campus of Human Rights European Program. He's joined the Global Campus Coalition for Human Rights Collective since its establishment to build in transnational solidarity against human rights abuses. He's currently working on his master's thesis with a focus on advocating a general comment about transgenerational violence on the Convention of the Rights to the Child, Article 19. His goal is to become further established in policy and fieldwork to build a stronger network between both fields of IHRL and IHL. I understand it's late night where you are. Thank you so much for joining us here, Mr. Jude. Also here with us is Dr. Rizal Sukma. Many of us may already be familiar with his works, but allow me to read his short biography. Dr. Rizal Sukma is a senior research fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Jakarta. Previously, he was Indonesia's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Ireland, and the International Maritime Organization in London from 2016 to 2020. He joined CSIS in 1990 as a researcher and assumed the role of executive director in 2009 until 2015. Dr. Sukma also served as former chairman of International Relations, the Muhammadiyah Central Executive Board from 2005 to 2015. Since receiving a PhD in International Relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science in 1997, he has worked extensively on such issues as Southeast Asian security, ASEAN, Indonesia's defense and foreign policy, military reform, Islam and politics, and domestic political changes in Indonesia. Dr. Sukma has served as a member of the National Committee on Strategic Defense Review at the Ministry of Defense and as a member of the National Drafting Committee for the National Defense Bill from 2000-2002, and the Armed Forces Bill in 2002 and 2003. He was the first Indonesian to receive the Nakasone Award in July 2005 and named one of 100 global thinkers in 2009 by Foreign Policy magazine. His many publications include most recently the ASEAN Political and Security Community, Opportunities and Constraints for the R2P in Southeast Asia, which appears in the Pacific Review, and Indonesia Finds a New Voice in the Journal of Democracy. Thank you very much, Dr. Rizal, for being here with us today. A few housekeeping notes before we start the discussion. Please join this discussion by placing your question in the chat column of the YouTube, and we will try to take in as many questions as time permits. Now, to set the narrative of the discussion today, I would like to start with Mr. Ju. We've been following the campaign for Mr. Salin, which you and your colleagues at the Global Campus Coalition for Human Rights have established. Now, could you please share with us what the campaign is about and what it aims to achieve?
Thank you for having us. I am Jude Martinez-Larnard, and I'm speaking from Los Angeles, so it is quite late here. And I'm with my colleague, Ika Riswandari, who's joining me from Indonesia. And a little bit about the Global Campus Coalition of Human Rights. It is a compilation of human rights students, alumni, professors, and scholars around the world who have come together from all regions to fight for equality, restorative justice, and democracy. And today we're here to introduce our stake in the Myanmar conflict. And our fellow conflict, Salin Tet, is a student who has been detained by the Burmese military junta. And he is currently being held by Burma police, and we are determined to help free Salin and to free all people who have been targeted by the junta for their freedom of expression and their right of education. We have found that our colleague Salin is an entry point to the conversation about Myanmar, particularly those who face serious violations of academic freedom and freedom of expression. And we're compelled to make noise about the gross human rights violations sweeping over Myanmar by the coup starting in February over the ethnic conflict and ultimate genocide. And these have gone largely unnoticed and are further buried by the mass shutdown of 80% of the internet for people in Myanmar, preventing civil actors from releasing crucial information. And our aim is to take narratives from Myanmar and to circulate them on the web through our platforms. And this is what we have done with Salin's case. And we have found success in ways and not in others, specifically relating to the ASEAN and the AICHR systems and mechanisms that we hope to discuss a little bit more today.
Thank you. Could you perhaps share with us, we understand that the campaign has reached out to ASEAN bodies such as the ICHR. Could you perhaps share with us how they have responded and whether you are perhaps satisfied with this response, please?
Thank you. In regard to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, and we have a few different opinions on this based on the interactions that we've been having, particularly with the Philippines and Indonesia sectors of the AICHR. And we believe that the member states of the AICHR are showing complacency as they simply observe the situation in Myanmar. And we believe it's quite contradictory in the ASEAN declaration as more students like Salin, human rights defenders, pro-democracy activists, and ethnic minorities are arbitrarily detained without warrant, often killed. And our coalition is calling the member states' credibility into question due to inaction and lack of responsiveness to the human rights violations in Myanmar due to unanimous performative collectivism and the principle of non-interference, despite the declaration being non-legally binding. And the performative collectivism is something that we want to speak on because it is in favor of those who are in power, that being performative, the oppressors who use this term as a misnomer to convince the international community to turn a blind eye as civil and ethnic actors are in high risk and vulnerable groups for political violence. And this collectivism benefits the oppressor, and ASEAN is enabling it out of negative obligation via the principle of non-interference to respect the so-called state autonomy. And in our experience, we have reached out to many of the member states. And the member states, although we have made contact with, as I said, the Philippines and Indonesia, the dialogue that has been held with them is very bureaucratic and fell into normative recommendations to make formal complaints to the ineffective AICHR body. So we are hitting a wall, and we know that the member states of ASEAN can take it further by using their influence to mediate, negotiate, and being a third party to help relieve Myanmar and innocent civil actors from suffering. And we really believe that peace building is of extreme importance at this crucial moment in Myanmar's history to loosen the junta's grip on the Burmese people. Otherwise, they will only accelerate the genocide and possibly take it further into something like we cannot predict. And this is what we have experienced so far, and we have made progress on our own terms, but we seek to make more.
Right. Could you perhaps also share with us alternative ways forward that perhaps representatives of these ASEAN bodies have put forward during your discussions? Was anything of this sort discussed?
No, the only thing that was discussed were very general recommendations that they were able to give us. And those recommendations being to make a formal complaint to the mechanism. But we know that the mechanism is ultimately ineffective to the declaration itself being non-legally binding and having this collective ideal, which we don't believe is something that should be really sought after at this moment as people are being oppressed and facing a genocide, especially the ethnic minorities within Myanmar. And we don't believe that something like a complaint is ultimately going to pass the level of principle of non-interference. We think that this is going to be prioritized over our actual complaint. So this is why we are trying to put more pressure on member states, particularly the ones that are neighboring states around Myanmar, to help convince and become third parties to the dialogue and discussion about the coup.
Right. The thing with neighboring states of Myanmar is that they share a very similar view and culture of coups, if I may put it that way. Of course, it's not a culture, but it's something that occurs. It has occurred and may occur in the future. So that being said, it might be difficult to sort of place hope on these neighboring countries. Was there a reason why the campaign reached out to the Philippines and Indonesia? Well, were they, in your opinion, are they more sort of, they have this leadership figure, do you think, or are they an icon of democracy or something? Yeah.
Thank you. We reached out to all member states. These are the only member states that we got a response from. Otherwise, we have not been getting a response from the other participating states under the ASEAN system. And we don't know if this is something because they are a beacon of democracy or because they are the leading figures of democracy within Asia, because there is a history of coup, there is a history of violence, but this history is not unique to Asia or the Asian Pacific. It is something that we see across the world. So we don't want to put it necessarily within this context just because we don't think that this is an excuse for complacency, especially if the declaration does celebrate ideologies like collectivism. Where's the collectivism when people are being hurt? And is that collectivism only exclusive to those who are the majority or those who are in power? That is our question for the member states who are not taking action, or rather the action of inaction under the current coup. So these are our current concerns, and we hope to get into contact with the other member states, but so far we have not received a response. And there has been just lack of response to the ones that we are in contact with. So it is definitely a concern right now.
Right. You mentioned also that there were a few successes in your attempt to echo this campaign. Could you share with us some of these successes?
Well, this is something that we were definitely thinking about when thinking about the power of the military junta, the power that they've acquired. It's not slowing down. And as the internet continues to be cut in Myanmar, this has largely prevented a circulation of information from being released to the international community. And it also puts each person releasing information at risk when they exercise their courage to connect with people outside of Myanmar to help bring awareness to the situation. And it really begs the question, how can ASEAN deter the adverse impacts at the lowest level possible, which is what we just discussed. And we know that at least through our own advocacy at the Global Campus Coalition of Human Rights for our Free Salin campaign, we recognize one thing, and that one thing is that voices and stories are powerful. And we have created petitions, we have created letter organizing to do outreach to domestic and international actors, connecting with IGOs, trying to share the story of Salin in order to use it as an entry point to conversation and use it as an entry point to hopefully mediation, negotiation, and peace building in the future. And this is something that we want to get our hands a hold of more without putting people at risk. And this is something that we believe is super important when trying to convince the international community to become a little bit more involved, because people are more involved when it is more personal. And to make it more personal, we need personal narratives and we need to amplify them. So we do have suggestions in order to do this on multiple levels, but we know, at least for ourselves, that this has been the most effective way to reach people as much as we can, and at least reach the 2 member states that we were able to get a hold of. And we hope that if we are able to further elaborate on this story or other stories through the campaign, that it will only grow to not only free Salin, but free anyone who's being currently detained by the Burma military junta.
Thank you. You mentioned an interesting point previously on collectivism. As we know, both fortunately and unfortunately, that is just how ASEAN works. Everything is decided as a united front, unless there is a consensus to act on something bilaterally. But how do you feel, how do you think we can end the numbers of killings and fatalities that is currently rising, and the numbers are rising very quickly, although we don't have an established number at the moment because news is very minimum. It's at a very minimum because the media is their hands are tied and they're being restrained. But how do you think we can bring those numbers to a halt while the government and the society figure their negotiations?
Thank you for this question. It's a good one. I think when discussing collectivism, it doesn't have to be exclusive in every aspect of the member states' ideology of being united. It doesn't have to be exclusive to everything that the ASEAN system stands for. It can be separated. You can have collectivism within culture, but not have collectivism when addressing violence, because that is something that we see that is extremely separate. But we see that if you say collective always, then that allows collectivism to be misused by people in power and used to oppress others. And this is something that we don't want to see from member states. We want to see that member states can distinguish when collectivism is necessary in solidarity for each other. And we believe that this is an opportunity for the ASEAN member states to show the international community that their collectivism does not have to be exclusive, but it can be within a myriad of aspects. One being, yes, with culture, no with violence, no with genocide. And we think that in order to stop these numbers from growing and the killings from happening, there are a few things that need to happen within the international community, within the domestic issues, etc., that can be done at the emergency summit this week on the April 24th at Jakarta. And we have a few different recommendations. And The stories released either publicly or privately have power to build global solidarity for Myanmar. In specific cases like Salin's as a student, an engagement is key to put political pressure on the junta to enter into mediation and negotiations, or at least like the emergency summit that we've just mentioned that we know will be happening. And for the general people in the international community, we encourage people to circulate information, to get involved with our letter writing and put pressure on officials to move and take action. For member states, actors like the ICRC or the Berghoff Foundation have tremendous capacity to step in as mediators and be third party, but they must be called in by the AICHR. For international and EU bodies, defenders of human rights, they have a bigger stake due to their core belief of, quote, never again. And this was created after the Second World War to never see the mass murder or genocide of people again. And ethnic minorities are being killed under the guise of, quote, ethnic cleansing. But no, this is genocide embedded in isolationist economic policies and repressive military rule. The international community must enforce rule of law out of positive obligation to help those in Myanmar suffering at the hand of conflict. And here at the coalition, we believe that this dialogue, especially this weekend, will only be effective if they address the junta's ideologies, which I just mentioned were the economic policies and repressive military rule. And the way to do this is through an intersectional approach. And it is of the utmost importance to dismantle their power through this approach and recognize the multiple identities for the Burmese people. This can be done through incorporating other sectors outside of law and politics, like agriculture, water, energy, land, and the environment to make a bigger economic safety net to satisfy possibly the military junta. And it will shift the conversation from brutality of power to economic relief instead. And that is a conversation we want to see. But that conversation cannot happen without including these other actors, specifically voices of students, to hear their plea for justice as they hear the junta's request for power at the summit. We believe other people need to be sitting at the table who have stake in this. And that's something that we really encourage member states to include when moving forward with peace building and with the initiative for mediation and negotiation.
Thank you. I'm intrigued to ask, and I hope this is not too sensitive a question, but why do you believe the military junta is against education? Not education per se, but the right to be educated in whichever aspect of education that there is?
This is an excellent question, just because I believe that not just in the military junta within Burma, but also the military junta anywhere, education is the key to freedom in a lot of ways. When you're educated, you're able to understand situations at a greater extent just through history, through politics, through sociology, and a myriad of other educational aspects, right? And we believe that when you're against education, you're against people revolting because you can see more conformity otherwise. And this is something that we believe that they are pursuing. So people will not be as aware about what is happening or as aware about what they are saying or the type of propaganda they are putting out to further their own political agenda and their own political violence. And when people are educated, they fight against this. They will stand up and they will take a stand and they will protest. They will become activists. They will fight for pro-democracy in order to see more equality within their location, within their demographic, within the place that they live, and want to see come to fruition as a very democratic society. And when you don't have education, this is a lot harder to achieve. So abolishing education and taking it away is a way to halt this in the future to, again, further the political agenda. So that is something that we believe that is taking place for this reason. Thank you.
Right. On top of the unrest and the protests, unfortunately, the COVID, the pandemic is something that the people of Myanmar are having to face. This causes extra, perhaps stress and also restraints. So understanding the case of Salin, how do you feel the freedom, or how do you think the freedom of to be educated, the freedom of education, will help those in the general face of the pandemic and also in this political crisis?
I think during the pandemic, when thinking about education, there's something that I want to bring up that I said before, and that is the intersectional approach of making a bigger economic safety net to satisfy possibly the military junta. And when you have a bigger economic safety net, it stimulates the local economy. And when you can stimulate the local economy for education and for economics, that is going to make the country a little bit more powerful and a little bit more prepared to interact with the international community. And especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, we believe that if you have these two things, then you're better prepared to then face things like this and maybe have more negotiations, maybe have more donations from other states that can give vaccines, that can give better information, or even give people to volunteer to give vaccines at a higher rates. And if you have the economic safety net on top of that, then that's only going to bring justice to more people and bring safety to more people and the right to health to more people. So we see that it is all connected in a way. And I hope that answers your question. Let me know if I need to elaborate more.
No, that answers the question, but it's triggered another question, a sub question, if I may. Do you think that the junta is not particularly into creating an economic safety net, because you believe that this is something that needs to happen and is perhaps not strong enough during the times prior to the junta? Do you think that this is not in their political agenda?
Well, I said before that I know during the beginning of the coup, something that they were very invested in was the economic policies that they held as an ideology on top of what we see as a repressive military rule. So we know that economics is always tied to power, but how can we shift the economic idea and not tie it to power? And I believe the way that we can do this is by building a bigger economic safety net that makes it seem that there is possibly more power to be held, when instead it's just going to help more people instead of taking it away from them, because it's going to stimulate so many different parts of the economy and so many parts of the society and be beneficial, hopefully for all, and draw attention away from power, away from oppression, away from violence, if this can be satisfied. Because a lot of people want to argue for power, a lot of regimes want to argue for power because they want to satisfy some type of economic goal, whether that economic goal is for power itself. Unfortunately, sometimes it's like this, or whether it's for their own people to get more water, to get more energy, to get more agriculture. People want to survive. And people unfortunately think that the way to do that is through power. But I believe that the way to do that doesn't have to be exclusive to power, or doesn't have to be has to have power as a duality. It can be solely because of a bigger economic net to just create safety. So I think that, I hope at least, that by doing this, or at least negotiating in this way, it will pull the military junta back from committing more political violence within Myanmar. That's not something that I know for sure, but it is something that myself and the coalition really hope for in the upcoming discussions, at least at the emergency summit about Myanmar in Jakarta this weekend.
Thank you. Sorry. One last question before I move on to Pak Rizal. The situation in Myanmar may not be equivalent to that of the Arab Springs, which broke out in 2012, if I'm not mistaken. But nor has it developed into a civil war, at least as of now. However, the numbers of fatality and the use of force is concerning. We can agree on that. Now, do you feel that the international community is reacting enough towards the situation in Myanmar? Do you think more can be said?
I touched on this a little bit about what people can do, and I didn't exactly touch on whether it is coming to fruition for the international community to even see the situation in Myanmar. And I don't think that it is talked about enough. I don't think that it's circulating. And the junta is being incredibly smart about this by shutting down internet, by shutting down Wi-Fi, and denying people's right to access to the outside world, outside of Myanmar. So they're unable to convey the situation in the way that it should be conveyed. And this is detrimental. And we even saw that a lot of news stations, for example, the one that I know about is CNN, who do go into Myanmar, are putting people at risk. So now many news outlets, media outlets are discouraged from going in because they know that they're putting people at risk. And this is something that we need in order to create a bigger conversation and to slow down the deaths when there is more political pressure on Myanmar. And I want to draw back specifically to how the junta is targeting freedom of expression while doing this and repressing people from media outlets. And specifically, I think that this is done through the Article 505 law, which is allowing the junta to pull, to stop, to halt anyone walking, driving, anything, and to arbitrarily search them. And in their search, they can find a piece of paper or they can find some type of notepad that can be ambiguously stating something negative about the government, something negative about the state or the junta. And if this is happening, or if they believe that this is happening, they don't have to show any evidence for it, by the way, then they can detain people, they can torture people, they can help people, they can engage with enforced disappearances. And I believe that a mix of all these things is really preventing the Burmese people from getting out into the international community. So the international community does not know. And of course, we know that other states know, but they're not engaging because their societies are not getting them to engage. We know that as civil actors, we need to put political pressure on the states that we're a part of in order to get them to engage with situations that we care about. And I know for me, at least being in the US now, I was in Greece previously, is that a movement is happening here. And the movement is the AAPI, the Asian violence and the racism that is happening in the States. And this is a conversation where we can find intersectionality, because we could say, if you care about anti-Asian violence, then this is an entry point into the conversation about Myanmar, at least for the states. And many states have these different entry points, and those entry points can create the political pressure to allow civil actors to reach out to the embassies, to then contact Myanmar and put political pressure there and to raise awareness. Because when the awareness circulates, when it spreads, this is the part where we finally see action being taken. And this is what we need to see. So I really hope, at least at the summit this weekend, we can see some type of negotiation or encouragement to give more internet back, to give more Wi-Fi back, because that's going to be the entry point to circulate more important information on Twitter, on Facebook, on even YouTube or through Zoom, and people aren't going to be as heavily tracked as they are now and putting themselves at risk. So I don't think that the international community is engaging the way that they need to, but I do believe that there is an entry point, and that would be it. So I really do hope to see that at the summit this weekend.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to Pak Rizal. In your recent publication in the Jakarta Post, you call out on the ASEAN leaders to act now. Now, at this very point in time, leaders are hopefully sitting together, preparing for the ASEAN summit to discuss this urgent matter and perhaps their strategy moving forward. Now, the General Min Aung Hlaing is scheduled to attend this summit in Jakarta, so we know he's not shying away, he's not backing down. And as you mentioned in your article, the call-outs have had no particular effect on the Tatmadaw. So what this does is basically shift the pressure from Myanmar to the ASEAN member states instead. So now all eyes are on them. Everyone is eyeballing them. The academic community, the media, the general public, everyone is trying to forecast the next move and what the next step may be. Now, leading the way towards this engagement is Indonesia. Alongside Indonesia, but perhaps slightly less aggressive, is Singapore and Malaysia. In your opinion, do you feel that what Indonesia is doing is enough, is sufficient, and could Indonesia be doing more?
Thank you so much. So I really enjoy discussion early on, with Jude. and I hope that your campaign will be a success. And I'm sorry, only 2 member states of ASEAN that respond to your campaign. But that's another topic that I think we can discuss. Now we can also discuss here why the ICER is very difficult to work with because the nature of ICER and so on. Indonesia has been trying all the possible and realistic in a possible and realistic way. Because number one, we need to raise the awareness, that this crisis, is taking place. Number two, we need to also show that, we do not tolerate, the takeover of power by the junta, through coup. In some, member of ASEAN, they make distinction between good coup and bad coup. But, for us, coup is all bad. There is no good coup. So coup should not be used as a legitimate, way of taking of power. And in fact, in 2005, ASEAN, has declared that it will not or shall not condone, any unconstitutional form of regime change. That includes a coup. But unfortunately, in 2006, at that time, Thailand, suddenly they have a coup as well. So, in that context, it's really a challenge, for ASEAN how to stand up to its own principle. Indonesia has no leverage, beyond the diplomatic means that we have and that we put into work at the moment. And in fact, I'm not sure if we don't keep pushing, that there would be no, ASEAN's attempt, to try to find solutions to the issue. So we believe that now it's very important to have a meeting and then try to find a ways to stop the killing, to stop the violence. So the fact that General Min is the one who will be representing the Tatmadaw in the ASEAN Secretariat means that we are giving him legitimacy as the legitimate power holder in Myanmar. So it's not at all. So I think it's very clear from Indonesia's side. I think immediately after NLD won the election in November, President Jokowi already congratulated Aung San Suu Kyi for the outcome of the election. So for us, the issue of recognition is not really an issue there. And when it comes to legitimacy, of course, anybody who take over power from elected civilian government using force is not legitimate. That's very clear. So there is no debate about that. So it's not a legitimate rule by the Tatmadaw. But we need this meeting tomorrow, simply to find ways how to stop the violence. I can't say that I'm optimistic, about the result, because a lot of factors. We know that all the sanctions imposed by the US, by the UK, by the EU has not actually stopped the use of force, the killing by the Tatmadaw in Myanmar. And then there is no strong reason to believe that this ASEAN's call for the same the same behavior from the junta would work better. But there are a number of I think opportunities that we can capitalize on, and that hopefully will put pressure on the Tatmadaw, on the junta, to start stopping the killing.
Okay. You mentioned opportunities. Do you think that? Okay, this is my opinion. I will try and be as clear as I can. So this is my opinion, is that what will happen at the ASEAN summit tomorrow is they will all sit together and try to discuss ways forward and perhaps ways to end the killings, because that is the most imminent issue at hand. But then after everyone goes back to their countries and they return, this will then be once again swept under the rug. And then what we have left is basically a record of inviting General Min instead of Aung San Suu Kyi, in hope of pressurizing the junta, the military, to stop the killings, which may perhaps happen or not happen. Do you agree with this sentiment?
No, I think the upcoming special summit will be a bit different. And I think you know how ASEAN work. In the past, any summit, every leader will make a statement, and then they all go home. And then the chairman will issue the chairman statement or the joint communique. But this time, I think hopefully that all the leaders, at least a number of leaders, would ask the junta, to actually stop violence. So that's, I think, it's very important, to happen at the summit. So it's not the usual round of statement among the leaders. We also expect, and then this is my guess. So I think General Min, he will try to explain what's going on according to his own version, and then try to inform the summit that they are in control. This is only a few disturbance and so on. So I think he would do that, but hopefully ASEAN leaders will not actually just say, okay, thank you so much for your briefing, and then let's go home. And then, but we hope that ASEAN countries can put forward a package of demand, if you like, to General Min that he needs to agree on. Here, there are a number of options that are being discussed among the ASEAN 9, and I think the junta already knows that as well. Number one, that ASEAN can just demand the stop of killing, the stop of violence in Myanmar, and ASEAN will offer its help in distributing the humanitarian assistance in Myanmar, through the AHA Center, so that there will be an ASEAN task force coming into the country and to deliver humanitarian assistance. If the general promise and commit that they will stop the killing, and also they need to be a commitment that they are going not going to disturb the ASEAN work on the humanitarian sector. That's the first idea that is being discussed. The second idea, of course, for less than that, is the ASEAN countries agree to appoint the envoy that will continue to engage stakeholders in Myanmar, and then find ways how that ASEAN can facilitate negotiated political settlement on the current issue. This is where I think what Jude just mentioned, that we need to bring all the parties to the table and then try to negotiate. But don't forget, we are dealing with the Tatmadaw here. That will not happen unless they stop killing first, because they are the problem now. So the Tatmadaw is the problem. They start killing. Dialogue cannot take place when they continue the killing. So there is that commitment first. There should be a framework how that we can make sure that the killing stop. So that's I think the preconditions for any dialogue. Number two, they need to release political prisoners, and that without these two happening, then I don't see how dialogue can take place, unless probably somewhere outside Myanmar. But again, that's also risky, because those who want to have dialogue, they travel outside and then they cannot come back. That's also, we don't want scenario. That is not a scenario that we want to happen. So the key is really stop the killing, then release political prisoners, then we can talk about what sort of dialogue that they want to have. And here ASEAN is not in the position to dictate what are the topic of the dialogue should be, what the outcome should be. But ASEAN should stand ready to facilitate that kind of dialogue if they want. That the second I think option that's being discussed. The third option is ASEAN or some ASEAN countries, because it's very difficult or almost impossible, to get a united ASEAN position on any issues, let alone on the question of Myanmar. Then a number of say member states within ASEAN, a coalition of the willing, they form their own a grouping, then work with say extra regional powers like China, India, and Japan, and try to find a way to stop violence and to help the people of Myanmar through humanitarian works. The question is really, will the junta say yes, right? So that is the big question. This is the million question that everybody don't want to think about at the moment. But we do, explore also ways on how, to respond if Myanmar say no to the demand that they need to stop killing, if, the junta say no to the demand that, ASEAN will lead the humanitarian assistance and then be in the country. So if you ask me to speculate how ASEAN would react to that, I would say there would not be any ASEAN one reaction, to say if the junta say no, to whatever ASEAN put on the table. ASEAN will be divided. So here, I think we will face, a very serious problem, and then whether, number one, to just, abandon ASEAN as a framework to look for a solution, or we continue to use ASEAN with whatever tools, still available at the ASEAN level and try to engage, continuously engage, not only the junta, but also other players, other actors. Because if the junta say no, I can tell you, with great sadness that, the civil war, which is basically is taking place anyway, but it's not, nationwide, will become, a nationwide armed conflict that, everybody, will try to solve at the moment.
How likely do you think it is, for them to say no to these negotiations?
Well, I think it's quite likely, and even though it's hard to tell, because we haven't heard, any response, any comment, any views, from the junta so far. So I don't know their thinking, but judging from what they did before, it's very likely that they come to Jakarta and they hope that they will get a degree of legitimacy or recognition, if you like, even though Tatmadaw is a reality. And then we need to recognize that reality, not recognize the junta as the government in Myanmar, and then try to explain, to the ASEAN leaders why they took over power, what is the plan. Then I think they will try to present the 9 points plan again, election in 2 years, blah blah blah, and so on. And then they just keep silence, and then at the end would say no to whatever proposal that ASEAN will put on the table. So that is very likely, unfortunately, and then I think the whole international community, in a way, now is actually, we're hitting the wall, like Jude said, because the only other alternative available, are the one that, I think will create even more problems. Number one, for example, the US imposed no-fly zone, and then if the Tatmadaw, breach that no-fly zone, and then the Indian Ocean Fleet will bomb or attack Myanmar, that will bring Russia, China into the picture, and that will complicate the issue. The second scary option as well is, which is unlikely, the R2P. The question is, can the 5 agree to that? We know that some Security Council members will not agree to the R2P, especially I'm talking about the third pillar of the R2P. So I think it's very difficult to get agreement for the UN Security Council to invoke the R2P. Number two, which country wants to contribute troops to invade Myanmar? Because once you send troops to Myanmar, and then it's become a region-wide scale of conflict, which involve China and Russia, which I don't think that anybody wants that.
You mentioned earlier that if it comes to it, and of course, if this would be very fortunate for everyone, for a dialogue to take place between all 10, and possibly someone to facilitate, dictate the topic of this dialogue. If not ASEAN, or someone from the ASEAN member states, then who do you think this third party should be? I want to say third party, but there are in fact 10 people here. But who do you think this actor should be? Should it be a particular country, someone from the ASEAN +3 perhaps, our EU cousins, America, China, because there's always been this debate, or perhaps put both of them together, put them into the pool, or should it be an organization, for instance? Who should lead this negotiation process, in your opinion?
Well, the negotiations should be undertaken, by the Burmese themselves, by all the groups, by the NUG, by the Tatmadaw, by the ethnic, arms organization, and also the NGOs, So something like the peace conference framework, can be, I think, the model, for that. But ASEAN should be, ready to facilitate, if ASEAN is asked, to do that. But again, that sort of dialogue is not happening, unless unless the Tatmadaw stop the killing and then release political prisoners, because that would indicate that they have a goodwill, and a positive gesture, to find the political solution. Because at the end, I think the outcome, must be, the return of power to the civilian rules and legitimate rules. So there is no other options, unless those the stakeholders decide some kind of arrangement that we don't know of.
If I may return to your article, we know that that ASEAN tends to approach any situation of crisis. They are trying to approach this as a crisis and taking this into the summit. Do you think that this discussion, this negotiation that's happening, that will happen tomorrow, is the same as acting now? I use your
well,
as a jargon.
It's late, because ASEAN has no mechanism to respond to crisis, because when we were writing the charter, back in 2007, there were some suggestions, from Indonesia that the charter should also include, how we respond to to crisis. It does have dispute settlement, but it doesn't have a framework or provisions on how ASEAN should respond to crisis, either in a member state or involving 2 or more member states. It doesn't have that. So that's I think is really a problem. When this coup took place in Myanmar, they can only have this foreign ministers meeting, even that's already late, and then issue a statement, because we don't have this mechanism to respond to any crisis. So that's why I think the idea of summit by Indonesia, in a way surprised a lot of ASEAN member states, because ASEAN has never done this, never actually organized a special summit to talk about a particular problem in a particular member state. Usually they just wait for June meeting, the AMM, the summit in November and so on. But this time, because we realize the severity of the problem, the seriousness of the problem, and that if we don't really push for finding the solution, it can get worse, and then it will have impact not only on the people of Myanmar but on the entire region as well, including some member states who are close geographically with the Myanmar. We will have the impact. So we need to have this special meeting, and I can share with you, even finding the date for that meeting is a very difficult. So that's why I wrote that article. I was so angry, because some leaders could not find a convenient date for them to travel. Even they agreed on 24, still not all leaders can travel to really try to find solution to the most serious problem that taking place among the ASEAN member states.
Thank you. There have been talks of suspension of membership. Although this is not a new solution proposed by people who study ASEAN, but this is something that is increasing in discussions to serve as a deterrent, hopefully. Do you think this is the way to go? What is your take on this?
No, again, the ASEAN Charter doesn't say how you suspend a member. So it's nothing in the ASEAN Charter about that. So the problem with ASEAN, once you join, you get stuck. You cannot actually expel the member. And there is no provision as well. Whether a member can just exit from ASEAN. So this is I think is a good momentum that we need to revise that charter. So there are a number of a number of issues in that. Number one, as I mentioned earlier, we need to put mechanism or procedures and how ASEAN should respond, to the crisis. So you don't have to wait until 2.5 months, before you have a summit, in order to discuss it. Number two, of course, they need a lot of new provisions, when it comes to how you defend human rights, in ASEAN area. This is, I think, the issue that you mentioned. I can, I share his, frustration, especially the ICER, cannot, protect. They all only do promote. For example, when we wrote that charter, we asked that these articles to be put in the charter that ICER can actually take up complaints from about the violation of human rights in the member country, and then do the investigation, fact-finding mission, and so on. But of course, it's rejected by the rest of ASEAN member states. So we need to revise the charter, which, if possible, also include how regime sanction should be also in the charter. For example, if you breach certain articles, then you will be banned from coming to the ASEAN meeting. And then if you breach key principles, such as doing the 4 crimes that Jude mentioned, the genocide, the crime against humanity, you can be expelled, and so on. So we need to push for that. And then Indonesia will be the chair of ASEAN in 2013. So I think if we can campaign, and then ask the Indonesia's government that this is the opportunity to revise the charter, then will be, I think, a great idea. So the ASEAN Center of the Gajah Mada can put forward the proposals to one of your alumni, who is the foreign minister now, to actually take the lead in revising the charter.
Yes, we will definitely take that on board, but this is a very concerning issue, because many times when we face situations as such, we always look to the ICER and we always question, why aren't they doing anything about this? And then when we do go to them, their response would be because they don't have further mandate. And so it has always become a question of, so what then is your mandate? If a situation as imminent as this, as urgent as this, cannot be tackled, who then can we pressure to give them that mandate? It seems as if they are somewhere in the middle, and we have to make sure that someone gives them that mandate. And so hopefully what we wish to see in the following weeks after the summit is an actual follow-up where the ICER is involved in this, and perhaps the AHA Center as well, to just distribute and perhaps provide some relief in Myanmar. If I may revisit the case of Salin, with fatalities reaching 700 and above, what is the likeliness of this situation turning into a civil war, or if you believe it's happening already? Because both parties are not backing down. What type of agreement do you think the Burmese and the military can agree on? What do you think is workable for both sides?
This really depend on the junta now. So if they say they agree to the humanitarian force, just stop the killing, and then they should not shoot anyone anymore, then other steps can be taken. If not, then I think we have to find stronger measures in order to put pressure on the generals of Tatmadaw. And some of targeted pressure, I think is very good, and then but needs to do more. Regional countries also should be part of that. For example, within ASEAN, we know that Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam might have stronger leverage in putting pressure on the junta, because of they have also greater interest in seeing stability return to Myanmar. Indonesia doesn't have any investment, huge investment in Myanmar, so we can't actually use that in order to put pressure on the junta. So that is the key, I think.
Okay, thank you. I see we have a few questions coming in. If I may, I'd like to address these first. From Mr. Tunggul Wicaksono, he asks, since the Myanmar military staged a coup, many parties involved in the peace-building efforts through collective action. However, the initiatives are not legally binding. To Mr. Jude, which prominent issue regarding human violation needs to be raised, and how should we shape the narrative for ASEAN member states? To Pak Rizal, as the world is witnessing the crackdown, do you think sanctions against the military junta should be a short-term solution? Is there another way in passing a strong resolution during the transition to guarantee the safety of Myanmar's people? I'd like to invite Mr. Jude to respond first.
Thank you. This definitely relates to the Salin campaign, especially in the first part of that question regarding human rights violations and what is of the most prominent importance when discussing it. And I think as Salin and a lot of other students, pro-democracy defenders, human rights defenders, etc., something that they're all experiencing is the right to academic freedom, which is the scholar's freedom to express ideas without risk of official interference. And this is constantly violated by the law that I mentioned earlier by the Tatmadaw, and being consistently charged with Article 505, Myanmar's penal code, about talking against the state or the junta. So this is something that definitely needs to be addressed, as that is essentially the movements that are happening within Myanmar against the junta itself. So I think that this is being used against them so heavily that this is likely connected to freedom of expression, freedom of education, etc. This needs to be addressed. As for the second part of that question, how to shape the narrative for ASEAN member states. Something that I hold personally to be true is that we're not free until we're all free. And when our neighbors are experiencing violence and when our neighbors are experiencing coups, it's close. And that means it can also happen to our states, your states, and they must be addressed. Otherwise, these ideologies can bleed into other parts of the world and in other states and happen to those states as well. And we've seen that historically. It's a historical pattern that has happened, is happening, and will likely continue to happen unless we have initiatives and directives and systems, mechanisms, protective mechanisms that are going to address this explicitly within mandates. And that's what we were just discussing. And I think that it would be a good idea to have, as Dr. Rizal Sukma said, more crisis management in order to address these more effectively. And that is what I would like to see in the narrative of expressing the collectivism in the non-exclusive way, like the collectivism of culture, the collectivism of humanity, rather than the collectivism of non-interference. How do we interfere to persevere our societies, to persevere our humanity, and to help people survive, and not just survive at the bare minimum, a very low standard, but survive wholeheartedly in a way that benefits all, especially within a region like ASEAN. So that is what I would recommend, especially with things that I have said before about economic safety nets. And that could definitely be something that is an entry point to that conversation, how different states can help each other economically. Because if there's more economic circulation, then there's more likelihood to dialogue and there's more likelihood to discussions that could happen. So that's something that I would recommend and something that I can see. I don't see that going smoothly, but I do see it at least happening and possibly succeeding, but definitely not smoothly. Thank you.
Thank you. Pak Rizal, would you like to comment on sanctions against the junta?
Well, sanction is meant to change the behavior of the party under sanction. That's very clear. So by nature, any sanction cannot be long term, but it just is meant to change the behavior of the Tatmadaw. Which behavior that the sanction wants to change? Of course, the use of force and also the legitimate hold on power in Myanmar, and also the political prisoners should be released, and so on. So the current sanctions, I think, it's meant to change the Tatmadao's behavior in that three areas. But over the long term, so I think we need more than just sanctions, to actually help Myanmar, find a long-lasting, peace process. So it require, even like the support, also from the international community, to development in the country, and so on. But that's, for later. So it's actually not now, because now is the pressing issue is really, how you stop the killing, and then how you start helping the people of Myanmar through the humanitarian assistance, and then how you create a space so that the Myanmar stakeholders can start a dialogue. So that's the short-term priority. But unfortunately, the sanction have not even worked in order to create that change of behavior among the Tatmadaw so far. But it doesn't mean that that everybody has to resume their ties again with the Tatmadaw. But we need to find another combination of factors so that the sanction can be effective in order to change the behavior of the generals of Tatmadaw.
Thank you. Do you think there is another way in passing strong resolution during the transition to guarantee the safety of Myanmar's people?
That's what this ASEAN summit is trying to, I think, to do, to get the commitment from the Tatmadaw, that number one, they need to, as I mentioned earlier, they need to stop the killing, and then also to provide guarantee that the delivery of humanitarian assistance can be undertaken by ASEAN. That's require a guarantee by the Tatmadaw. But at the same time, it also need to, ASEAN also, once the Tatmadaw say yes, to the demand that they should stop killing, then I think ASEAN should bring other stakeholders into on the table to discuss how the humanitarian the delivery of humanitarian assistance can be undertaken by ASEAN, because they are the stakeholders who are more important when it comes to the ASEAN effort to deliver humanitarian assistance. So ASEAN, even though some might not like it, they need to talk to NUG, the National Unity Government. They need to talk to the armed ethnic groups, and they need to talk to NGOs as well.
Thank you. We also have another question from I'm the Black Tulip. The question is, Myanmar coups a history of extreme brutality in the past, as killing passes 700 already. To what extent can we expect the international community to call for the R2P if Myanmar says no to the recommendations? I think we mentioned this briefly in your Rizal.
Well, I don't think that is possible at the moment, because the R2P, I assume that the one who asked this question referred to the third pillar of the R2P, which is actually putting together a force and then send them to Myanmar, and then to stop the Tatmadaw from continuing the killing against its own people in Myanmar. But that will require the agreement by the 5 UN Security Council permanent members, which I don't think is easy. Number one. Number two, I don't think there is appetite so far, even among the 3 other Security Council members to contribute troops, and then to do the humanitarian intervention or military intervention in Myanmar. So it's not there yet. And then if you look at the last meeting of the Security Council, even the statement has been watered down by China, by Russia, and also by Vietnam. So reaching an agreement at the UN Security Council is almost impossible at this point. So I hope that people would not try to create a false hope in among the Myanmar people. They suffered enough already, and then they should not give this false hope with regard to the possibility of the R2P. But the international community now, actually, at the moment, I would argue that they are doing the R2P, the second pillar. Try to enforce and put pressure on institutions called Tanmadao in Myanmar, to do the R2P, to exercise their responsibility to protect their own people. So this is where I think we also should explore more. What are other venues available in addition to, say, pressure from ASEAN, or pressure because of the sanction by the UK, the US, the EU on Myanmar.
Thank you, Pa. My last question. The media has been relatively silent on this matter. Some would argue that this may or may not have something to do with the involvement of China backing the military. Do you agree particularly with this statement?
Well, I think a lot of people misread, the Chinese position when it comes to the coup, in Myanmar. I think they're not happy either, because for the last, 5 years, they've been cultivated, very good relationship with Aung San Suu Kyi, and in fact, their investment are booming in Myanmar. No. They know that the Tatmadaw has always been, this rather independent and rather, I think, suspicious of China, in the past. So what happening now is not really in the Chinese interest. So I don't think that we can say that they will support, the coup or they will support the Tatmadaw. They have so much, at stake in terms of the investment. And then, of course, China has always tried to maintain good relationship with whoever in power. So I don't think that the closeness with the junta before the democratization started in 2010, actually would make them, to support the coup at the moment. And in fact, they have been warning the junta, to actually, restore order, and so on, because, their companies are being burned, their factories are being burned in Myanmar. They know the sensitivity. So that's why, like a lot of other, countries, they also hope that ASEAN can get a breakthrough, when it comes to stopping the violence in Myanmar. So, I hate to say this, but I will say it anyway, that many countries hiding behind ASEAN at the moment. And then they will cheer if ASEAN fail. This is funny. I have this bad feeling that a lot of people are hoping the ASEAN to fail, tomorrow, at the summit. But at the same time, they're all hiding and then push ASEAN, to take the lead, then try to resolve the problem. This is the paradox, of international relation, which I think, is sad.
I absolutely agree, Pa. I may be one of those people. Okay, thank you very much, Pa Rizal. I have one question for Jude before we wrap up this discussion. As we discussed previously, human rights has always been one of the many topics which ASEAN member states tend to sweep under the rug in fear of a backlash. So as they gather at the ASEAN Secretariat tomorrow for the summit, what do you hope to see as a result of their discussion on the ongoing unrest in Myanmar?
This is similar to something that I was exploring earlier when talking about the collectivism. I think that a lot of things can be separated, and I hope that this is a point in history where the ASEAN member states can recognize that violence is unacceptable. And I know that violence is something that is reoccurring within the region, but at this point, it's not something that should be allowed at this time anymore, especially when seeing ethnic minorities being killed and essentially the beginning of a genocide. This is something that we don't want to see in other member states. And we would hope that other member states would be able to reach out to their colleagues, to their partners, in the case that that ever happened to them themselves. So that is something that I would like to see. And also, I would just like to see the political prisoners be freed, essentially, and have that conversation be starting, especially for our colleague, Free Salin, and whose trial is on the 28th of April, being charged under the 505A law. And we know that that is something that we want to be dismantled in Myanmar. But that is what I hope for to happen. I don't think it will come to fruition just because of the trajectory of conversations over human rights and the mechanisms and the cultural relativism versus universality principles in human rights law that is often discussed between both regions of Western world and the Eastern world. But I'm hoping that something else can be sparked and something else can be created, at least out of the name of gross human rights violations in Myanmar.
Thank you very much. Apparently, we have two further questions from our viewers. We will take these two questions as the last questions before we wrap up this discussion. One question is from Shukron Subhi to Mr. Rizal. What do you think if the coup can be resolved? Who should have the right to lead Myanmar afterwards, and whether it is to return it to the Aung San Suu Kyi government or perhaps an alternative solution?
Well, I think it's not for the outsider to tell, who should, be the leader of, a country. But, it's really, should be decided by the Burmese themselves. And then so far, I think every stakeholders except for the Tatmadaw, in Myanmar agree that, the result of the election in November 2020 should be honored. And that means, I think the NLD won, and then, the National Unity Government is something new, but, it's basically also include, all the civilian leaders who won the election in November 2020. That's, I think it's something new, in Myanmar, for the first time that they include everybody, and then they think in terms of this, federal way of thinking, which include the ethnic, groups, even though we don't see many Rohingyas yet, in that group, but hopefully that, can be start, for a better, arrangement for future, of Myanmar.
Okay, thank you. Apparently that was just one question I misread. Okay, thank you very much. So we've lapsed our question and answer session. If I may conclude very briefly, the gist of the discussion that we had today, we touched on the issue of collectivism and how this has hampered talks of human rights, violence, and genocide. This should be reformed, perhaps revisited once again to see if we can include talks of human rights and violence in order to create an environment which is safe for engagement, circulation of information, and also a way to put political power aside and talk about ways to shift ourselves into an economic recovery for the sake of everyone. And these are some of the ways we can move forward into peace, into talks of peace at least, and for a more stable region if we see it from a regional point of view. And one of the key entry points for this is education, because it helps to create this economic safety net, as it helps to stimulate the local economy. It is also important to, as ourselves, be civil actors, to put pressure on our political leaders to engage whichever parties who need to be engaged in order to resolve this situation. We also touched upon how the summit that will happen tomorrow should be and hopefully will be different to the previous summits, which we are used to seeing in the past few years. We hope that the ASEAN member states are able to put forward a package of demand, which should contain talks of stopping the killings, offering help in distributing humanitarian assistances. The ASEAN member state should also will also agree to appoint an envoy to continue the engagement of these talks and perhaps a negotiated settlement. But first and foremost, is to reduce the number, or perhaps even better, to stop the number of killings and to see a release of political prisoners in order for a dialogue to take place. Another important point that we also discussed today is for this situation to be a momentum to revisit the Charter, to see areas that are seriously struggling as it is not responding to the situation within the region and the developments, the political and economic developments that are happening right now. It is important that we start to look into the contents of the Charter, the ASEAN Charter, and add in provisions that include ways to defend human rights. This should be an issue that we should be talking more about, especially in light of this situation. I would like to sincerely thank both of our speakers, Mr. Jude and Mr. Rizal Sukma, for being here with us today. It has been such a pleasure to moderate this discussion. We hope to be able to see you again in our next discussions to speak on issues of ASEAN, human rights and diplomacy. So thank you very much once again. I yield my time to Ms. Fadila. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Yelida, for moderating the session. And also thank you very much again for the very insightful discussions to both of our guest speakers, Dr. Rizal and also Jude. I'm sure there are a lot of key takeaways that we can learn and reflect from today's discussions. So this concludes today's webinar. And for all the participants, thank you so much also for joining and also the questions. Please stay tuned to our social media to get to know more about ASEAN and also participate to our future events.
Thank you.
Again, yeah, thank you so much, and also Jude. Again, do not forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel at ASEAN Study Center and also our Instagram at ASCUGM and our official website at aac.visipol.ugm.ac.id. And to receive your certificate, do not forget to fill out the evaluation form that will be shared. And we hope you are stay safe and healthy. I'm Fadila and see you in the next event. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.